Reverend Abbott and Those Bloodshot Eyes, Walter Dean Myers. When I was a kid in the late 40s, I thought the whole world was like Harlem, full of life and colors and music that spilled out into the streets for all the people to enjoy. Life was a constant adventure, although some moments were a lot more adventurous than others. Take, for example, the fight between the kids in our block and Reverend Abbott, our visiting minister. We didn't have anything against Reverend Abbott because he was white, and I didn't think he had anything against us because we weren't. In fact, he was probably a good man, and I'm sure he didn't deserve to have so much trouble during his first summer serving the Lord. Reverend Robinson, our regular minister, was away for the summer trying to raise money for the church's upstate camp, Rabbit Hollow. That left Reverend Abbott just about in charge, or at least he thought he was. Actually, if Reverend Abbott hadn't tried so hard to help us, things might have been different. Take the time he tried to protect us from Sugar Ray Robinson, the greatest fighter in the world. We used to play a game called Scullies. You drew numbered boxes in the middle of the street, and you shot bottle caps or checkers from one number to the other until you became a killer. And then you knocked out all the other bottle caps. One day, about 4 of us were really involved in the game of Scullies and didn't notice the long, almost pink Cadillac cruising down the street. The driver of the caddy was Sugar Ray Robinson, welterweight championship of the world. In those days, a lot of athletes either lived or hung out in Harlem. Sugar Ray would often come around and play with the kids, the same way that Willie Mays, the baseball all-star player, did when he came to New York. Okay, so Sugar Ray yelled at us, asking us why we were blocking his car. Then he got out and challenged us to a fight. Now, we knew that Sugar Ray Robinson was the welterweight champion and would not hurt any of us. But Reverend Abbott didn't know anything of the sort. All he saw was a man getting out of his car and challenging the kids. He came out yelling at Sugar Ray and telling him that he better get back in his car. Sugar Ray took one look at the tall, thin man in front of him, shook his head, and got back in his caddy. We tried to explain to Reverend Abbott that you don't jump into the face of Sugar Ray. He didn't seem to get it. He just kept insisting that fighting was wrong and that we should learn to turn the other cheek. It was clear to us that the good Reverend was trying to mess things up for us. Being a kid in Harlem wasn't the easiest way to live. We didn't have much of a crime problem in those days, but we did have to worry about the window watchers and the root ladies. We certainly didn't need anybody else to look out for. The window watchers were the biggest pain because there were more of them. They were the women who used to bring their pillows to the windows and watch what was happening on the block. Sometimes they would talk to each other from the windows or order up collard greens from the vegetable man who brought his truck around in the afternoons. But mostly, they would watch what was going on and report to your mother if you did anything they considered wrong. I remember one time Johnny Lightborn threw a candy wrapper on the sidewalk in front of the church. A window watcher spotted him from the 4th floor and called down to another window watcher on the 1st floor. Johnny's mother knew about it before he got home. This was bad, but the root ladies were worse. The thing was, you don't mess with the root ladies. Not that you actually believed that they could do anything with their roots and candles and mumbo jumbo, but there was no use taking chances. When you went over to La Marqueta, you saw them sitting in rows of colored candles and twisted little roots that Fat Butch said looked like dried up shrunken people. And you saw that they looked a little strange, and you crossed the street. No big deal unless somebody threw a snowball at one of them and they looked at you with those evil eyes. All you had to do if a root lady gave you the evil eye was hold up a mirror and shine it back at her. You had to know how to protect yourself when you were a kid. In a cigar box in my closet, I kept a small mirror for the root ladies, a crucifix for vampires, and a ground-up peach pit to throw on dogs with purple tongues. You also had to know some of the rules. You didn't play handball against Root Lady's house, walk in her shadow, or bring a broom near her. If you followed the rules, you didn't have to worry, even if she could make her eyes glow and send them out at night to get you just when you're ready to fall asleep. What the Watchers and the Root Ladies did like was that all the kids in the neighborhood went to church. In fact, most of our lives were centered around the church. I started Sunday school at about 4 and received my first book, Stories for Every Day of the Year, as a prize in the Tots Parade when I was 5. In the summers, we went to Bible school, and it was more like a summer camp than a religious school. Every kid in the neighborhood had made a wallet in Bible school. We also learned to play basketball in the church gym. The ceiling in the gym was low, and you could tell who played ball in our church because they had flat jump shots. The church also had dances for teenagers, and that really seemed to upset Reverend Abbott. The dances and chaperones who carried fans advertising local funeral parlors. The chaperones would go through the crowd and put the fans between couples dancing and tell them to make room for the Holy Ghost. When Reverend Abbott saw his first dance and the 13 and up crowd doing their thing, he was upset. There was no room for such going-ons in the Presbyterian church, so he made an announcement that there would be no more dances while he was in charge. What he wanted to do was substitute relay races and Bible quizzes for the dances. We didn't have MTV in those days or video game arcades, and the dances were about the only social event. Somebody suggested a compromise. We would have relay races and square dancing. Reverend Abbott was pleased. The next Friday was the first square dance. The chaperones stayed on the small stage and looked on approvingly. Then Reverend Abbott went to his study, and somebody put on the mambo record. It was hard to tell exactly who put on the mambo record because it went on a second after the lights went out. The chaperones, mostly mothers and big sisters, immediately started for the light switches. They weren't that upset. But when Reverend Abbott opened the door and saw a host of healthy young bodies swinging to a frantic Latin beat and the eerie dimness of the red emergency lights, he was beside himself. The names of all the teenagers present were taken, and their parents were notified the next morning by the committee of church ladies. Okay, so Reverend Abbott wanted a fight. We decided to give him one. We had had young ministers like Reverend Abbott before. They would work for a few months in the church, then go to another area, or, if they were lucky, to their own church. We found out that Reverend Abbott was scheduled to give his first sermon on the second Sunday after breaking up our dance. We also found out that there was going to be an important funeral in the church later that same day. Sam Johnson, the numbers man and the barbecue king of 8th Avenue, had died. Mr. Johnson was famous for his girth and gold tooth, his promptness in paying off when you hit the number, and his barbecue sauce. He was rumored that his funeral would be attended by every big-time gangster in Harlem. There would even be, the story went, some Italian gangsters from the East Harlem coming over. So Reverend Abbott was going to have not one, but 2 chances to show his stuff. He would give the morning sermon at 9:30 and then conduct the funeral at 12. He wanted to give them both right. Several sisters said whenever they passed the minister's study, he was either sweating over his message or down on his knees praying. It was to be his big day. It was going to be our big day, too. The kids were divided into 2 groups, the littles, of which I was one, and the teenagers. It was the teenagers who came up with the plan to undermine Reverend Abbott, but the littles were part of the plot. Sunday school started in our church at 8 o'clock, and it was over at 8:45. At 9:15, the record caroling bells would start, calling all the worshipers to Sunday morning service. At 9, Reverend Abbott was in his study, making last-minute changes in his sermon. Girls with ribbons in their braids and Vaseline rubbed on their faces and knees were out in the front of the church. Some of the boys were planning to go to the West End Theater, which was showing 3 features and a serial. But some of the littles knew what was going to happen. And one of them had already sneaked upstairs and found out that it was Mrs. Davis who was going to put on the record that would summon everyone to church. Her favorite hymn was, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus," and its version of Record Bells sounded very nice. The little who discovered Mrs. Davis in the sound room went out and relayed the message to the big kids. At 3 minutes to 9, the telephone on the first floor rang. There was a breathless voice on the wire, an urgent message from Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis was a pillar of the church, a tall woman with broad shoulders, a wide dark face and eyes that turned up so slightly she had been one of the earliest members. Now she was being called downstairs with the word emergency ringing in her ears. Emergency in those days did not mean that your cat was in a tree or your car had a flat. An emergency in Harlem meant one of 2 things, either a death in the family or a fire. Mrs. Davis rushed to the sound room, grasping for the railings heavily as she made her way down the stairs toward the first floor telephone. The sound of her feet on the steps could be heard all the way down the hall. Much to her surprise, there was no one on the phone when she answered it. The sneakers on the teenagers who ran into the sound room could hardly be heard. The record on the player was removed and another put in its place. The volume was turned up slightly. The door was closed and the padlock was put in its place. Not, mind you, the same padlock that was usually there and for which Mrs. Davis still held the key in her hands. Then the teenagers disappeared on their sneakered feet, down the stairs and out the side door onto 122nd Street. The record could be heard all over the neighborhood. "Ooh-wee, don't roll your bloodshot eyes at me." Heads turned, mouths dropped, open, eyes widened. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. The lyrics were less than elegant. This song, about a man who had been out all night, carousing and whose eyes were all bloodshot in the morning, wasn't that original. But coming from the church sound system, amplified for the glory of God and the amusement of the entire neighborhood, it would long be remembered. Reverend Abbott himself flew up the stairs, 2 at a time, sweat popping off his brow, only to find the heavy door helplessly locked. Mrs. Davis followed him, banging on the padlock with his fist. She took a look, saw the padlock had been changed, and turned and rushed back down the stairs in search of the church janitor. The record played over and over until the janitor located and the lock broken. By the time the record was removed and the proper one put in its place, the entire church was in uproar. Some people were upset, and others suppressed smiles. We littles went into the back alley and told each other what records we would have put on if we had had the chance. We also stuck our fingers with a pin and swore in blood that we would never tell anyone who had done it, even though only a few of us knew which teenager had actually been in the sound room. Reverend Abbott started his sermon by talking about how some people didn't realize how lucky they were to have a nice church like ours. Then he tried to get into his regular sermon, which was about all the work that Noah had put in when he built the ark and why we shouldn't all work for God, and why we should all work for God. But he was so nervous that he forgot most of it. The funeral went a lot better. Because Fat Butch's mama was Sam Johnson's goddaughter, he had to go to the funeral with her. He said that Reverend Abbott went on about how it wasn't easy to tell a good man from a bad man, and how we shouldn't judge people without seeing their true hearts. All the gangsters at the funeral liked this a lot, and one even cried. The next Sunday, Reverend Abbott put 2 teenagers in charge of making sure the right record was on, which stopped all the hopes of the littles that Open the Door Richard would call the faithful to church. On Reverend Abbott's last Sunday, he thanked the congregation and said that he thought he was ready to face any challenge that God might put before him. He was probably right.